The NBA's salary cap is a very underrated aspect of team building that stands as a huge hurdle for a lot of the teams trying to put together a group that can make a lot of noise. You have to balance your ability to find diamonds in the rough that you can lock down on affordable contracts, paying your promising young talent appropriately when the time comes to extend them, and bringing in free agents to fill the gaps. And the teams that win championships are the ones that find that balance. In many cases, though, teams end up handicapping themselves by handing out monstrous contracts to players that do not play up to their salary, and that brings us to today's video. Today we'll be discussing the current 5 worst contracts in the NBA now that we're approaching the end of the season and have seen how they perform for an extended period of time. I'm also not including any contracts that are expiring after this season in today's video. Before we start though, it turns out a good amount of you watching right now aren't even subscribed to the channel, so if you enjoy the content, consider hitting the subscribe button, as not only does it help out a ton, but I'd also very much appreciate it. Now with that being said, let's begin. Starting off with the player with maybe the worst contract in the entire NBA right now, we have Jordan Poole of the Washington Wizards. Poole's career trajectory has been pretty crazy through 5 seasons. He was a late first-round pick who spent some time down in the G League in each of his first 2 seasons in order to get some consistent run after struggling to find his place in the Warriors' rotation early on. To put it simply, those first 2 years he was wildly inconsistent. He needed to tone down his wild and out-of-control shot selection and decision-making, and all of that combined with his struggles defensively made it tough for the Warriors to trust him. Sounds a bit familiar, right? His 3rd season is when his ascension began, and it also happened to coincide with the Warriors winning an NBA Finals. So out of nowhere, Poole went from being a fringe bench scoring talent to being an incredibly impactful secondary scoring option on a title team. That 2022 season had people thinking that Jordan Poole was going to emerge into an incredible scoring talent with the flair and creativity that he brought to the game as a shot creator, but then last season he was unable to recreate that magic, which would have been the first big warning sign. He did score a career-high 20 points per game last season, but his shooting percentages went down, and then in the postseason, he was unable to recreate the magic that he had during the 2022 playoff run, averaging just 10 points per game throughout that playoff run, shooting just 34% from the field and 25% from 3. The Warriors had just paid Poole a big 4-year contract extension worth a total of $128 million too, so clearly they saw the writing on the wall and shipped him out to Washington, where he was expected to have the freedom and the lack of pressure to explode individually, but somehow he has only gotten worse. This year he's being paid a salary in the tier just below the full max contract, yet has been one of the absolute worst players in the entire NBA this season compared to others with his similar level of usage. Averaging just 16 points per game, shooting 40% from the field and 31% from 3, Poole's season has been an absolute nightmare, and realistically, he's best suited to be a 6th man while being paid to be a good number 2 option on a team. The next player up on this list of the worst contracts in the NBA right now is Jaylen Brown of the Boston Celtics. This isn't holding the Celtics back at all right now, as they're still sitting in first place in the standings, but what it does do is speed up their window of contention, because long term, it's going to be really hard to construct a dominant contender with so much money already allocated to him. This gets accentuated even further when you take into account that Jason Tatum is also due for a contract extension in 2 years, and he's also going to be demanding a massive deal just like Jaylen Brown got. Now, Brown is a multiple-time All-Star, so his reasoning for being on this list is not the same as Jordan Poole's reasoning by any means, but right now, Jaylen Brown has the most expensive contract the NBA has ever seen. Not Nikola Jokic, not Steph Curry, not LeBron James, not Joel Embiid, not Giannis Antetokounmpo, it's Jaylen Brown with the biggest contract. The extension that he signed this summer is 5 years long, worth a total of $304 million, over $60 million annually. He became him eligible for this monstrous supermax after being named second team All-NBA last year, and with that being the case, it's obviously what he demanded, which put the Celtics in a tough spot. Their choice was either to let Brown's current contract expire after this year and have him play it out disgruntled, or they could just give in to his demands and handcuff themselves in the long run, but also keep their team together. And they chose the latter because they knew that their team is capable of winning it all right now, and they can worry about everything else later. Jaylen Brown is a great player, yet he's also a flawed one, and will probably only ever be in the lower end of the all-star caliber tier of player, so to hand over the biggest contract in NBA history to maybe the 25th-ish best player in the league is always going to be tough to swallow, but if the Celtics can win it all in the next 2 years, then I think it'll all be worth it. The next player we'll be discussing with one of the 5 worst current contracts in the NBA is Ben Simmons of the Brooklyn Nets. Ben Simmons is now in the 3rd year of his career's downfall that seemingly came out of nowhere. After being named an All-Star 3 seasons in a row as a member of the 76ers, he held out, forcing a trade in the 2022 season, and since then, he has never been the same. Luckily for him though, he penned a 5-year contract extension worth a total of $177 million back in 2020, so after this season, he still has 1 year left on his contract, and what makes it even worse of a contract for the Nets specifically is that his salary increases every season on it, so next year, Simmons will be paid $40 million, after making $38 million this season. Ben got traded to Brooklyn in 2022 and didn't end up playing a single game for them that year as he recovered from his back injury. He came back to the court last season, but was only able to stay on the court for 42 games, which is about half of the season, because of his nagging back issues, and when he was on the court, he looked like a shell of his former self. This season has been a lot of the same story, as he's been missing a lot of time, and been putting up just 7 points, 7 rebounds, and 6 assists per game over his last 2 years as a Net. This is a player on a basic max contract who was once one of the most promising young talents in the league, dominating defensively, pushing the pace in transition, and flashing elite passing talent, who just never took the next step that many thought he was capable of taking because of his refusal to venture out of his comfort zone, which his comfort zone, of course, was in the paint. He still refuses to shoot any kind of jumpers, he's not the otherworldly defensive talent that he once was pre-injury and pre-trade, and his chronic back issues may be something that could plague him for the rest of his career, unfortunately. The next player we'll be discussing with one of the 5 current worst contracts in the NBA is Bradley Beal of the Phoenix Suns. This, like the Jaylen Brown contract, is another example of a contract that pretty much the entire NBA world knew was an overpay, and yet it still happened anyway. The tail end of Bradley Beal's time as a Wizard was some of the most frustrating team management of all time, because they kept insisting that they were committed to building around Bradley Beal, which was just an impossible task, considering the assets and cap space they had at their disposal, and the fact that Bradley Beal just is not good enough to be a franchise cornerstone. He's another player who was a good all-star caliber guy, but was way closer to being a fringe top 25 player at his best than he was to being a superstar or a legit number 1 option, and yet the Wizards still gave him what was at the time the biggest contract in the history of the NBA. The deal was for 5 years and $251 million, and to make it even worse for them, they gave him a rare no-trade clause, so when they finally did realize that it was in their best interest to trade him, they couldn't even negotiate for the most potential value in return, because Beal had to sign off on any deal that went down. The Wizards ended up trading him for a return that didn't even feature any first-round picks, only players and pick swaps, and now he's on the Suns, with 3 years left on his contract, and his days as an all-star already seem to be behind him, as he's averaging just 18 points per game. Beal is also dealing with nagging back issues on top of all of that, so needless to say, his pedestrian production and his health concerns make this contract a doozy. And finally, the last of the 5 worst contracts in the NBA today is Zach LaVine of the Chicago Bulls. There's a common theme amongst many of the players we've already discussed. They're former All-Stars who are no longer playing at that level, and to top it off, they're now dealing with worrying health concerns that could plague the rest of their careers. Zach LaVine is yet another player that falls into this category. LaVine signed his extension coming off of 2 consecutive appearances in the All-Star game, and at the time the Bulls were making aggressive moves trying to compete in the Eastern Conference. Unfortunately for the Bulls though, their plans have fallen flat on their face, and they're now stuck in the limbo of mediocrity. With LaVine as their number 1 option, the Bulls have peaked as a first-round exit from the playoffs, and now his best days seem to be behind him. LaVine's contract was for 5 years and $215 million total, and it still has 3 years left after this season. LaVine himself was having his worst season since 2017 this year, and it then got cut short by an injury that required him to get surgery on his foot that will keep him off of the court for 6 months. He was averaging just 19 points per game this year, and the Bulls almost immediately started performing better without him in the lineup after he went down. So now with the team potentially looking to trade him, it becomes a lot more difficult to convince another team to pay LaVine $45 million per year to be a ball stopper on offense who has lost a touch scoring-wise and struggles defensively. And with that being said, that's all I have for you today. Make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment down below who you think has the worst contract in the NBA right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.